Hello, it's Dave here from Alphacool, and today we're going to be taking a look at how to install a Waterblock on an Nvidia RTX 3080 Founders Edition. Now, graphics cards are like unicorns at the moment, as are Waterblocks, but we wanted to make a video so there was one there when the market calms down. We're going to be using the Eisblock GPX-N acrylic Waterblock for the 3080 Founders Edition, and this is article number 11936 at alphacool.com. Inside the protective bag, and the second protective bag, you have the acrylic block in all its glory. The block is made out of nickel plated copper and acrylic, and it has this really nice premium look to it. Also included with the cooler is a box of accessories. Inside the box of accessories there's all the thermal pads you need, and that includes thermal pads for your backplate and thermal pads for the block itself. These come in 3mm, 2mm and 1mm, and these are all labelled accordingly. Also included in the accessories box are two flush stock fittings, a tool to tighten or loosen them, and an adapter to convert the 3-pin JST connector to standard 3-pin ARGB header. This means you can either daisy chain the LEDs with other Alphacool products or plug it directly into a controller or the motherboard. Finally, there's the thermal paste and all the screws you'll need to attach the Waterblock and the backplate to the graphics card itself. With the 30 series, the backplates are sleek and minimalistic. It's a rather nice anodized black aluminium backplate with a simple Alphacool logo in one corner. The backplate doesn't just make the GPU look fantastic, it also helps to dissipate the heat and also stops the PCB from bending. The last item that's included in the box is the instruction leaflet. Make sure you're using this when you're installing the thermal pads, as it makes things a lot easier. Installing the Waterblock onto the naked PCB isn't particularly difficult at all. However, removing the stock cooler from the Founders Edition card is a little bit more tricky than the previous series. The first job is to remove the 4 magnetic screw covers. These can be removed in a few different ways, for example a magnet or a pick, but we found that using some strong tape is the easiest and most consistent. To use the tape, you just push it onto the magnetic cover and then peel the tape away. The magnetic cover will be stuck to the tape, leaving the screw completely accessible. Repeat this process for all 4 of the magnetic covers and ensure that you put them somewhere safe. With these covers having magnets in them, they can get stuck to tools or other items that are lying around and become easily misplaced. To remove all of the screws, you'll need a Torx T5 screwdriver or a micro screwdriver set that includes Torx bits. There's 4 screws in total, so remove these and put them to one side to keep them safe. Once all these screws have been removed, it's time to remove another cover and access some other screws. This cover is removed by using a spudger or bezel removal tool. A guitar pick or another plastic tool can be used if you do not own these, but try to avoid using metal tools as they might damage the cooler. Use the plastic tool to lift the middle of the V-shaped cover. Once the middle lifts up and it's easily accessible, then use your hands to pull it up and away from the cooler. Once the cover is removed, we're going to be removing the 4 screws that were hidden by it. These are tiny screws, so be careful what you're doing, and at this size you can either use a J00 or a Phillips 00 precision screwdriver or screwdriver bit. Once all the screws are removed, you can pull off the large cover. The cover does have thermal pads attached to it, so it'll feel a little bit stuck down, so just be gentle and go steady whilst removing it. This will reveal 4 more screws that use a Torx T6 screwdriver. Ideally, you want to remove the screws from opposite from one another, rather than unscrewing one side then the other like we did. The only reason we did it like this is because it was far easier to focus the camera on one side than the other whilst we were working on it. There are 3 delicate connectors that need to be removed next. The first one is a 2-pin connector close to the 12-pin power connector. The second one is in the same place but on the far side of the PCB. And the last one is on the edge of the card opposite the PCIe motherboard connector. The first one is the trickiest one. To get this one out, we're just using a tool that can fit behind the ribbon cable and just being really careful with making sure the tool slips before the connector gets pulled out. Make sure you're careful with this one and don't be too forceful. The second one's a lot easier. That one you can get the tool all the way underneath it and you can put your thumb on the top to spread the weight of the tool and make sure you don't rip anything. The last terminal is slightly different. This is a small latch that needs to be slid back before you do anything. Once you've slid the latch back, you then remove the cable from the socket by lifting the connector out. Make sure you don't try to pull the wires here and remove it as close to the socket as possible. That's the trickiest part of the whole process done, so now we're back to removing screws. We're going to be using a Torx T9 screwdriver bit to remove the I/O bracket. We'll be using the I/O bracket again when we fit the block, so don't put that anywhere, but we won't be needing the screws, so make sure you put them somewhere safe. Now that all the screws are removed, we can take the PCB away from the air cooler. There's thermal paste and there's thermal pads here, so be gentle but firm when removing it. You don't want to damage anything or tear any thermal pads. Next, we're going to clean up the PCB ready for the new thermal pads and paste. The first job is to take away the Nvidia thermal pads from the card. We use our trusty soft plastic tool for this, as we know it can't scratch anything and it's very unlikely to damage anything also. You can use your fingers here of course, but do avoid using metal tools. We're also going to be using the same tool to remove some of the hardened thermal paste that is around the core. This is a little bit dangerous to do as there's some very tiny components here that are easily damaged, but if you're comfortable doing it and if you've got the experience to know when the paste is actually hard enough to do it, then this will peel off really easily. If you notice, the tool is aligned in such a way that you can't hit any of the tiny components that are around the core. If you do it like this, you're pretty safe, but as mentioned, do so at your own risk. Now that the excess thermal paste is removed, we're going to be using some 99% isopropanol and some paper towel to remove the rest of the paste. Using paper towel isn't really the best method as it can leave some debris, so try and use like a lint-free cloth or a microfiber cloth if you've got access to them. Whilst you're cleaning off the thermal paste, you can clean off the residue from any thermal pads as well. Once you've done this, the GPU should look something like this. The next job is to apply the Alphacool thermal pads. Using the instructions as a guide, we can see where each pad can go. The pads are colour coded, so the 1mm thermal pads are found in the bag with the blue sticker on, and the instructions show these as being blue also. You can choose whether to fit the thermal pads to the GPU itself or to the block. We're going to be fitting them to the block. It's easier because the instructions show exactly where you have to attach them, and this just eliminates all the guesswork. When adding the thermal pads, make sure you remove the plastic from both sides of the pad. The easiest way to do this is to remove one side, place it on the block, then use a fingernail or a tool to remove the second side. Make sure you pay particular attention to the positions of the 8x8x1mm thermal pads. There are 5 pads, but there's only 4 areas to place them. One of the areas uses 2 pads, one lay on top of the other. This is shown in the manual, and also it shows you exactly where to place them, so there should be no confusion. Once the thermal pads are in place, it's time for the thermal paste. There are many methods for the thermal paste application, but the main thing to remember is that you need the whole of the GPU die to be covered. If you're using non-conductive paste, as we are, it doesn't matter if there's a little bit too much paste on, but don't go crazy. This is about the right amount for the size of the die. Now that the paste and pads are on, it's time to introduce the PCB to its new cooler. For the 3080 FE, you can put the cooler on a flat surface and then put the PCB on top of the cooler. Ensure the holes are lined up, but try to line these up as you're putting the PCB onto the cooler rather than moving it around too much when it's in place. If you move it around too much, the thermal pads can move to an incorrect position and you might just need to realign these. Inside the accessories box, there's a little baggie with these almost invisible plastic washers in. These washers are hard to see, and if you do drop them, they'll probably be lost forever, so be careful with them. If you struggle to hold the washers, we would suggest using a pair of tweezers to hold them, just so you can get them above the graphics card so they can't fall into the nether. You don't have to use tweezers, and we actually do use our fingers for 2 of them, just to show both methods. Use the washers, along with the screws with the springs on, for the 4 screws around the GPU die. When installing the screws and the washers, try and do them opposite to each other. Also, you may have noticed that we're only partially tightening them. This just allows the screws to line everything up and sit in the screw holes correctly. Once all the screws are in the correct place, you can tighten them fully. Once again, do opposite screws and there's no need to go crazy. Don't force anything. You do want to check each screw a few times though, as with the ultra soft thermal pads, they'll squeeze down to create optimal contact. You want to ensure this happens, and the only way to do this is to go over each screw 1 or 2 times. Once all the screws are tightened down, it's time to put a thermal pad on the back. This one's a 2mm thermal pad and it's the big square. Once again, this is colour coded in the instructions, and the instructions do tell you exactly where to put it. Make sure you take the plastic off both sides of the thermal pad and just pop it into the centre. Next we're going to add the final thermal pads. These ones are 3mm thermal pads and colour coded in yellow. Make sure you check where the thermal pads go in the instructions, because by now you may have become complacent. You might have just picked up the first thermal pad that came to hand and just put it on the graphics card in an area where you think it's going to go. You'll then realise later on down the line that you've put it in the wrong place and have to redo it on camera in front of everybody watching. Obviously this didn't happen to us, we did it all on purpose to make sure we could show you what can happen if you don't follow the instructions. It definitely wasn't a mistake by us, honest. Once all the thermal pads are in the correct position, it's time to add the I/O plate. We put the GPU on a box to assist us with this, as having the GPU overhanging makes it a lot easier. The I/O plate is sandwiched in between the backplate and the PCB. The way we did it was to add one screw through the backplate just to help us and assist us while aligning the I/O plate. Once it's in position, use a Phillips 0 screwdriver or similar and screw in the screws. We're doing the front ones first just to hold in the I/O bracket and then putting the other ones in. Once again, we're only partially tightening them for now, and then once everything's in place, we fully tighten them after. As with the previous screws, once everything's tightened, just go around again and just make sure everything's nipped up. Them thermal pads need to be making full contact. Once you're done with these screws, you've finished installing the Waterblock. It's that easy. It should look something like this. You've reduced the length and the thickness of the card and increased the cooling. It's now ready to be put in the system. Remember that if you're doing this while there's still product shortages, you're very lucky, and because our ARGB can be controlled via a controller or your motherboard, you can make sure everybody knows how lucky you are with some in-your-face rainbow effects. For those of us that aren't lucky enough to have all the hardware we want, remember, good things come to those who wait. Well, that's it for this one. Make sure you follow us on all our social media channels, visit our forums, and if you'd like to learn more about Alphacool products, consider subscribing to our YouTube. All of the links are in the description. Ciao for now.